The following is a text exchange which occurred between brothers on August 29th, 2021. 5:47 p.m. Do you understand what Johnny Appleseed was up to? I'm tempted to read a book about him, but I think I'll get lost anytime they use the word Swedenborgianism.
Is that the name of his church for which he was a missionary? All I remember about him is that he would plant trees in a nursery, build a fence around it, partner with a neighbor so the neighbor did the hard work of tending the trees and picking the apples in return for a share of the harvest.
Yeah, there was more business and spreading of new church doctrine than I was aware of. And less random seed chucking. Straight from the heartland, this is Things I Text My Brother. Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of Things I Text My Brother, a series of conversations which have taken place between the brothers Drouillard on subjects spanning the neighborhood and the globe, which will hopefully leave you smarter, kinder, and better looking. Today we're going to jump off from that dramatic reading that you just heard and discuss the topics therein. Maybe we'll talk about Emmanuel Swedenborg. Maybe we'll talk about Rambo. Maybe we'll talk about Paul Bunyan, John Henry the Steel Driving Man, alternative spirituality, Stacko Lee, or news right fresh from heaven. But we haven't plotted an exact course because we want you to join us on that journey. That's how it works on Things I Text My Brother. I'm Jeff. This is Brad. Let's talk about our texts. But before we drop knowledge of our text exchange in the same manner that a self-appointed early 19th century missionary dropped seeds, we need to take a look back because it's always important to make time to cleanse ourselves of our past sins and to continue our boundless quest for self-improvement through worthless information. Thus it's time for ablutions and edification. Brother Brad, it's my understanding that you have both an ablution and some edification for us this week. What do we have?
Tell me, Brother Jeffrey, do you feel we have an obligation to our listeners to call out when our show has said something, while not technically wrong, certainly is a disservice to society all the same?
We don't know anybody anything.
Well, I do believe so, and that's what I have for us today.
Okay.
This ablution is for me because I failed to correct something stated by Father Art during our conversation for episode 19, Chilito Candy and Freeze-Dried Fruitiness.
Ooh, that's a great episode, don't you think?
It is a great episode, and I do love candy. As listeners of our show know by now, we take our candy, if not seriously, something approximating that, I would say.
Yeah, just finished a bag right here.
For some unknown reason, I not only allowed Father Art to get away with saying that candy corn and Necco wafers were his favorite candies, I actively reminded him of Necco wafers being his favorite candy. That was a disservice to our listeners. Those are candies that should not be eaten under any circumstances. My apologies to all.
Yeah, if we're going to lead anybody the correct direction on anything, we're probably most qualified to do it about candy, so it would be a disservice not to. What's your edification?
So episode 17, Hallmark Christmas movies in the Soviet Santa.
You know what I'm going to say about that? That was a great episode, don't you agree?
I think it was a pretty good episode.
Yeah.
But in that episode, you shared, well, let's call it a thought-provoking Christmas story, possibly generated by a computer.
But probably not, yes.
I don't know. We mentioned infinite monkey theorem. Well, you did.
True.
As soon as I said something about that, because a monkey at a keyboard for infinite time could type out any given work like the collected works of Shakespeare.
Yep.
Well, the AI-written passage that you shared is actually part of a movement known as computational creativity.
Whoa.
Famous examples include Deep Spear, writing sonnets, Deep Bach, writing concertos. I guess deep is important to have in the name. And Whim, or the what-if machine, which was used to create a script that was turned into a musical called Beyond the Fence that was staged in England. This play includes the memorable line, "We will need more than jam to make it through a nuclear winter." I watched the play. It is available on YouTube, and it is something. It's not quite as thought-provoking as the Christmas story, but the "we will need more than jam to make it through a nuclear winter" is an excellent line in and of itself.
That's a good line. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Christmas on Christmas, the best line was definitely Santa was Bones, and Bones helped nobody. But right. I appreciate the jam and nuclear winter thing. That's good.
Of course, as with anything that we do as humans, because we're the worst, Microsoft's thinking about you chatbot becoming racist and sexist pretty quickly on Twitter is a nice reminder that humanity sucks, and we will ultimately make AI horrible.
In the great tradition of humans ruining things, Boaty McBoatface has entered the chat.
I love Boaty McBoatface.
Yeah, me too.
That was excellent. That was excellent.
Yep.
So that's my edification. The whole idea of computational creativity and the idea of training technology to be more than just a spitter out of information, but to become a creative force in the world.
We're cleansed, we're edified, we're ready to move on. Alrighty, Brother Brad. Well, this episode's text exchange is about somewhat of a local celebrity. One Johnny Appleseed who spent a lot of time around the area where we currently live here in central Ohio, but he's a well-known figure everywhere. What are we going to talk about first?
As with many things, my first experience with Johnny Appleseed comes from a Disney movie where he sang a song called The Lord is Good to Me. Do you know the words to that song?
Does it go, oh wait, I might actually know it. Does it go,
all right. Really, really close.
Oh.
But it's more like, the Lord is good to me, and so I thank the Lord for giving me the things I need, the sun, the rain, and an apple seed. Yes, he's been good to me.
I have heard that song.
Right.
Cool.
And so I knew that Johnny Appleseed, Johnny Chapman, was a missionary of sorts.
That was the first I ever heard of that.
Well, that song should have been our first clue, even as children, but I guess maybe we just didn't notice. So tell me a little bit about Swedenborgianism.
It's probably worth getting to Emmanuel Swedenborg via the channel of the guy we're talking about. Johnny Appleseed was a missionary, a self-appointed missionary, and...
Self-appointed missionary.
Yeah, he wasn't sent out by the new church or the Swedenborgians specifically to do this. He did this on his own. I think our American audience is well versed in the very basics of Johnny Appleseed, but maybe not the more in-depth version. Do you think our international audience, the people out in Bhutan, know a lot about Johnny Appleseed?
I would be impressed if they did.
So, Johnny Appleseed, aka John Chapman, was a real person. That's probably the place to start. And he was born a little bit outside of Boston in 1774 by most accounts. Some people say 1775. He eventually, when he reaches the age of adulthood, he starts filtering out west through Pennsylvania, eventually ends up in our neck of the woods in Ohio. And so this version of Johnny Appleseed that we know as kids is wearing what on his head, Brad?
He is wearing a cooking pot of some kind on his head.
Yeah, some kind of tin cooking pot. Is he wearing shoes?
Usually not.
Yeah, probably not wearing shoes. And he's just wandering around aimlessly, right?
With a sack tied to his side and then held up with his hand. He's just chucking seeds everywhere he goes, right?
Something like that. I think the biggest thing to know about Johnny Appleseed, other than the fact that he was a real person who was named John Chapman, is that he was not just wandering around on the breeze. In fact, one source that I was looking at said he was no dreamy wanderer. It's actually tied into a little bit of Columbus history, though, how Johnny Appleseed came to spend so much time in this area. Brad, have you driven on Refugee Road here in Columbus?
I have drove on Refugee Road at least once.
Do you know the history of that?
I don't. Never really thought much about it, to be honest.
It actually ties back to the American Revolutionary War, as some citizens up in Canada and Nova Scotia wanted to leave there so they could fight on the side of the American colonists against the British. They basically burned their bridges back to Canada. So they had to have places to live. And eventually the Continental Congress said that they would donate land to these people. They originally wanted to give them some land up by Lake Erie, but that land was already owned. It wasn't the government's to give. And eventually they give what's known as the Refugee Tract, which is a portion of central Ohio. So what John Chapman did is he came to this area, and he did it in other areas too, but he would look for areas that he was fairly certain people would be moving into. And in this case, the government giving these lands away to him meant there were going to be a bunch of people coming to this space. So he went ahead of them, planted nurseries before the refugees arrived, and as this immigrant flood came westward, he had basically built future markets. He would sell them trees, he would set up nursery arrangements with the people, and he was very strategic about it. And he bought and sold tons of these tracts of land, to the point where at some point it's believed he had at least 1,200 acres of land belonging to him. He didn't actually always know where those were, so he didn't keep the best books on it. He was wearing his tin hat, he was living in a very simple way, but that was actually by choice. John Chapman was not a poor man. While he didn't ever have a real fortune by conventional terms, he had way more than he would have ever needed. He was not just some yokel going around singing songs and just chucking seeds all over the place, which I think is pretty cool. But in addition to going around planting these seeds and arranging for other people to plant these nurseries, he was a self-appointed missionary. And because that whole description of what John Chapman was, a person who wanted to be one with nature, wanted to be friends with the people and the animals, his belief system seemed recognizable as something like a transcendentalist type movement. What it actually was is that John Chapman was following the teachings of this man named Emanuel Swedenborg. Have you heard of him?
Well, I have because I researched it. I knew that he was a missionary. I wouldn't have been able to know it was Swedenborgianism had I not seen your text.
Sure. I had never heard of this man, and I don't really want to focus too much on his biography. Just very quickly, he was born toward the end of the 17th century. He lived up to just before the time of the American Revolution, so the 1770s. And he's a pretty interesting character. The New York Times, I saw one quote where they credited somebody who had called Swedenborg the Swedish Leonardo da Vinci. And some research had been done by some scholars who thought that he is a person who probably has one of the highest IQs in history. But his twist on religion is less of a conventional religion. Even though this new church comes to be known by some in his name, he didn't want to have one unified ideal of what the church would be. Rather, he thought that anybody who was doing good in accordance to their religion was doing the right thing. You'd be accepted into heaven. He believed in kindness, he believed in charity, he believed in love, and he believed that God represented goodness. So doing good things brought you one with God. Which, as we've talked about religion a little bit in our podcast, especially back in our episode about Denville Curry, episode 4, those principles of the religion sound very much like religion is here to serve the greater good. If you're doing good things with your religion, that's a good thing for society, and he doesn't care if you're understanding your God the same way that he is.
I went down this new religious movement rabbit hole in my research. I was very interested because I hadn't heard about it. Obviously, you hear about a lot of different religious movements of the time. The Shakers were a similar time period. Obviously, there are a whole bunch of movements, even just in the Western tradition. I'm not even going into the Eastern traditions that were going on and all the different new religious movements there. So a lot of things going on, some apocalyptic stuff and some a little more related to spiritualism, neo-paganism.
Ooh.
But the thing that I found interesting about it was the New Church, or the General Church of New Jerusalem, whichever way you want to call it.
Yep, all names for Swedenborgianism.
Started to connect to New Thought, which was a spiritual movement that promoted healing through positive thinking.
Ooh.
But they took it to an extreme where they would choose not to use medicines and things like that because of that. So I found that interesting, kind of where the New Thought and the New Church came together. And so that got me looking at famous Swedenborgians.
Yes.
And so Helen Keller was one. Robert Frost was baptized in the church.
But he didn't continue.
Right.
As a Swedenborgian, but he did say that it did continue to shape his thoughts and influence him. Yeah.
Yeah. But then when you start to get into that New Thought and the New Church combining, you have Lois Wilson, who founded Al-Anon, right? There's religious piece to Alcoholics Anonymous, but there also is a lot to the power of positive thinking and reinforcement and healing through self-improvement. And one Dr. Oz also has some connection to Swedenborgianism. Not a Swedenborgian, but has stated at times that it has influenced his thinking.
Yeah.
He also played safety at Harvard. I did not know that.
Wasn't he the one who said that he combined some of the principles of Swedenborgianism with Islamic mysticism?
Yeah. So all that spiritual, mystical, all that stuff. I will say, I thought, I'm going to look at this new religious movement thing, and there's going to be a ton around, the 1850s to the turn of the century into the 1900s, and then it's going to kind of die off. I was totally wrong. It just goes on and on. There's constantly new religions and new orders, and some of them are somewhat parody, like Pastafarianism or the Church of Flying Spaghetti Monsters. Some of them are pseudoscience or UFO New Age. But some of it is interesting and some of it is thought-provoking. And then some of it is like the International House of Prayer, which I thought, that's going to be like a parody movement. Not at all a parody movement. They're listed as a charismatic movement. They started their church in 1999 in Kansas City. So they're actually IHOP KC is their actual moniker now. They started in 1999. They have been running a televised church service 24 hours a day since 1999 without stop.
Whoa.
They do sermons for 2 hours, and they sing and pray for 2 hours. Nonstop, 24 hours a day. But they've also been accused of some pretty bad things, so I don't really love them. But I was intrigued by the name, and it's smart branding. You're going to get people interested, and so, yeah. This stuff's happening all the time, and I didn't realize it was quite as prevalent as it has become.
Well, I guess anytime there's a new religion, whether it's crazy or not, and those probably aren't fair terms, but pretty much any religion is going to be challenged as if it is
Sure.
out there and crazy. And so Emmanuel Swedenborg himself, he was considered by some to be a genius. Most people seem to respect his intellect during his lifetime, but he bought into this brand of mysticism and dreams, and he was refining Christianity in a different way. So some people thought that was genius. Some people thought that he was perhaps fit for some kind of asylum. Nonetheless, it's not really until after his death that the church begins to form based on his teachings and around his teachings, because he wasn't trying to start something like that. He was just trying to figure out the best way for humans to interact in this space with whatever spirits guided them. So the new church is founded 15 years after his death. He dies in 1772. The new church actually comes about in England in 1787. And then it was brought over into the United States by people like John Chapman, a.k.a. our beloved Johnny Appleseed. So when he was going around, he was wearing his cooking pot on his head. It was actually a tin hat, which apparently was a thing, not to be confused with a tin foil hat, but a tin hat, which he did use to double as a cooking pot. I tried to do a bunch of research, aka I hit the Google button several times on the idea of finding different kitchen items that are used as clothing, and really all I found was a few Halloween costumes and people saying they swear by certain kitchen things rather than wear kitchen things. Which is a shame, because there should be a whole genre of clothing called kitchenware that people are wearing all over the place.
Well, I could sell it in my store, Spawn of Satin. The Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, Pastafarianism, there was I don't know if it actually went to court, but there was a woman who claimed to be a Pastafarian, went to get her driver's license photo, and she was wearing a colander or a strainer on her head, because that's the thing you do in Pastafarianism. And she claimed that she had a religious exemption for that head covering, and they allowed it.
She's like the queen of kitchenware.
See, there you go. So the Pastafarians agree with you that you should wear kitchenware on your head, although I feel like it's unsanitary to wear things on your head and then use them for cooking.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Anyway, in our original text exchange, my question was, what was Johnny Appleseed actually up to? We know some of the basics now. We know that he was indeed spreading seeds around in probably a more organized manner than we're told when we're just thinking of him as an aimless folk hero. And we know that he was spreading the religious doctrine. He would actually divide up Swedenborgian tracts and he would pass them out as he visited various cabins along the way. And by all accounts, he was a really friendly guy, a great storyteller, a person that people wanted to talk to. And when he would go to people and he would either present the word or preach to them or whatever form that took in different settings, he told them that he was delivering them news right fresh from heaven. What would you do if a man in a tin hat came up to your house and said, "Brother, I've got some news right fresh from heaven"?
If I open the door at all, because as you know, I tend to be a bit antisocial, and someone said something like that to me, I would absolutely engage in conversation with them, because I'm always intrigued to hear from people who have some ideas like that, to see where they're coming from.
And what if he gave you seeds? Would that make it better or worse?
You know, if it's something I would actually like to plant and grow, sure. If it's seeds that I have no interest in, then no. Giving me cotton seeds, I'm not going to grow a lot of cotton in my yard.
Question for you, Brad. If a mystical tin hat wearing missionary were to come to your house and say, "Sir, along with my message, I will be delivering you a small quantity of the seeds of your choice," what seeds would you choose?
Well, since tomatoes are in fact ambrosia, or the food of the gods, it would be tomato seeds.
Very nice. Very nice. So, John Chapman, he's going around, he's spreading the word, he's being kind to animals, he's being kind to Native Americans. Actually, one of the ways that he bonded with the Native Americans is that in addition to spreading his apple seeds, he was also known to have sown the seeds of several other medicinal herbs, such as dog fennel, catnip, mullein, rattlesnake root, pennyroyal, and horehound, which I've never heard of.
Do you know what any of these things were used for? Like, what did humans use catnip for?
To make their cats go crazy! I also read that fennel was known for a time as Johnny Weed, basically named after him. But that wouldn't be the only thing named after Johnny, because after passing through Pennsylvania and Ohio, spending some time up in Ontario, Michigan, he ends up passing away in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
You know who else died in Fort Wayne, Indiana? Pleasant Unthank.
Pleasant Unthank died there?
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic.
Right.
There was a baseball team, a minor league baseball team, that went to Fort Wayne in 1993. And in 2008, they rebranded. Their name is now the Fort Wayne TinCaps.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're named after Johnny Appleseed's headwear, and their mascot is known as Johnny Tin Cap, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. What do you think are the top 5 most popular fruits in the United States right now?
Strawberry Starburst, gummy worms, cherry Starburst, red Skittles, and a slush puppy.
Candy canes, candy corn, and syrup. Right, I got you, Alf. No, it's bananas, apples, strawberries, grapes, and oranges. So banana is the most popular fruit in the United States, not the apple, which I found a little bit surprising.
Bananas?
Bananas.
B-A-N-A-N-A-S?
Bananas, that's right.
That stat is bananas. B-A-N-A-N-A-S.
I spent at least 30 seconds looking that up, so it's true. What I was going to say about it, though, is the Johnny Appleseed legend is much better than the Boston United Fruit Company story of how bananas became popular in the United States. They did not spread the gospel. They did not spread happiness and joy to the places where they got their bananas from. So I would take the Johnny Appleseed story over theirs anytime.
Brad, would you enjoy eating some of the apples that Johnny Appleseed planted?
As it turns out, I probably wouldn't have, and most people probably didn't, because he only planted seed apples.
Yes.
Which are not good eating apples.
They're good for other things, like they're these small tart apples, and they're used especially for making hard cider and this type of brandy called Applejack. So Johnny Chapman was actually probably going around helping people have a little bit of a drink back in the early 1800s.
But cider was still pretty popular at the time. Beer was growing in popularity. Cider was, back to the founding fathers and everything, was one of the more popular drinks. And even children drank it because our water quality was so dangerous.
True.
That they needed these drinks. But that's actually the reason why there aren't very many trees left that Johnny Appleseed planted, was because of the fact that it was used to make liquor. And the FBI mercilessly cut down most of Johnny Appleseed's orchards in an attempt to prevent the production of homemade cider.
Oh, I didn't see that.
And they said someplace that one of the trees that's remaining is a Rambo apple tree. And
Rambo
apple tree. I did read someplace that can't be true, because Rambo apple trees were grafted.
He didn't do grafting.
He only do the seed apple. So it could either be his tree or it can be a Rambo apple tree, but not both. I don't know if any of that's true. But here's a fact I did learn about Rambo trees. According to author David Morrell himself, David Morrell wrote the novel First Blood, whose hero is
Rambo.
Rambo actually named his character after the Rambo apple because he was having trouble coming up with a name for his hero in his story, The First Blood. And his wife brought home a supply of fruit, and it happened to be Rambo apples. And he liked the name so much that he decided to call his character Rambo.
Well, speaking of names that we all know, we know Johnny Appleseed as this great American folk hero. We hear of him when we're very young, but he's certainly not the only one. So I went looking just to remind myself, all right, what are some of the other great American folk heroes?
I did that too.
And are they real?
I had the same question. I'm excited to hear yours.
I think I knew all of them, but I'm going to quiz you, and you're going to get them right, but this will be a great service to our audience as well. First one, the question is, Johnny Appleseed, a.k.a. John Chapman, was he real?
He was a real person.
Yes.
He did plant apple trees.
Yes, and he did a lot of other stuff, and the story was expanded on from there. But Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman, was a real person.
Woo!
How about your friend Paul Bunyan, the lumberjack with the blue ox?
Oh, I'm going to say not real, but based on real people. Did you read the stories about Fabien Joe Fournier from Quebec, who was the French logger who it might be based on?
No.
And also a French hero named Bunyan.
Bon Jovi?
Bunyan, which, if you're speaking the English and not the French, and you say Bunyan, not too far. So they say that it was a mix between the two. His name was on John, and his deeds were based on this dude, Fabien Joe Fournier, who was a French-Canadian logger and was killed in a fight, I believe with a hammer.
That's a way to go.
Yeah. All right, I'm ready for the next one.
As I do this, I want to give credit to Nicholas Parker from the New York Public Library website, who actually compiled a little quiz called Are These American Folk Heroes Real or Not? So each of the names I mentioned is actually mentioned on his list. Next one would be John Henry, the steel driving man. So this is the story of a guy who challenged the steam-powered hammer that threatened to make his job on the railway obsolete. And he beat the steam-powered hammer, but died of exhaustion afterwards. Is John Henry, the steel driving man, a real man?
Much like Paul Bunyan, not real deeds, real man.
You mean there was a John Henry? I'm sure there was.
There was a John Henry. He was real. He was likely a Union soldier who eventually got arrested for theft, and he probably died while helping to dig a tunnel in West Virginia, likely of inhaling dusts and things while doing so. And in the earliest songs about him, they even talk about him dying in front of a white house, and the prison where he stayed was a giant white building.
Interesting. As Nicholas Parker mentioned in his quiz, he has become a symbol of the abuses of American industry and an important symbol for the working class and labor and for African American rights. What about the unsinkable Molly Brown? Do you know her story?
Molly Brown was on the Titanic?
She was on the Titanic. She was also allegedly rescued from the Mississippi River as a baby by one Mark Twain and survived a tornado at 2 months old. But the question is the unsinkable Molly Brown real?
No.
Well, yes and no. Her name was Margaret Brown. She was on the Titanic. She did become famous after surviving the sinking of the Titanic because she used the fame, which she basically acquired by surviving, to help workers' rights and women's rights and other philanthropic causes. So then, after she became famous, and famous for good reasons, people started attaching other stories to her. So the Mark Twain thing, the surviving a tornado thing, probably not true, but the unsinkable Molly Brown was a strong character who was, at least in the case of the sinking of the Titanic, unsinkable. What about Pecos Bill,
Pecos Bill, absolutely not.
The cowboy who nabbed outlaws with his lassoing and sharpshooting?
I'm going to say absolutely not.
Yeah, he's a fictional character created for a magazine in 1923. He's, according to this article, part of a genre called fake lore, which I think is pretty cool. So fictional characters that some claim are rooted in folk tales, but are actually just the invention of a single author. How about Ichabod Crane, Washington Irving's central character of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow?
I know about Rip Van Winkle, but I don't know about Ichabod Crane.
So Ichabod Crane is a real person who is apparently buried on Staten Island, but that real person has nothing to do with the character. So it is an entirely fictional character that just happens to use a pretty cool name.
I did read about Rip Van Winkle, though, so talking about Washington Irving. And there is a theater professor who's spent many years researching this gentleman. There was a person named Rip Van Winkle who was a Dutch American, fled his home apparently for bars in New York City, and was there for about 20 years before his daughter found him in a play called The Old Dutchman or something like that. And then he went home and then he died not too long after that. And apparently he told the story that he was asleep for 20 years to cover for the fact that he just went on a 20-year bender. Washington Irving could have met him in one of the bars while he was out and about because he frequented those types of establishments in the same time period. Now, this is one theater professor's theory, but I was intrigued.
How about Davy Crockett and Buffalo Bill? Were they real?
Davy Crockett, absolutely. He killed himself a bar when he was only 3.
Yeah, and Buffalo Bill is William Cody. So not all the stories about those guys are real, but certainly real people.
Calamity Jane and Annie Oakley, same.
Yeah.
I also looked into one more, Stacko Lee.
Stacko Lee?
Yeah, Stacko Lee. We go back to episode 13 when we talked about murder ballads and coconuts.
Okay.
There was a real person named Stack Lee Shelton who committed murder on Christmas Eve, 1895, shooting a guy for taking his hat off his head during an argument.
What a jerk.
Yeah, and so there became a bunch of folk songs written about Stack Lee Shelton, Stacko Lee, and he got out of prison and then killed somebody else, I do believe.
You got other things, Brad?
The only other thing I was going to talk about was how many fewer varieties of apples there are now than when Johnny Appleseed was around.
How many fewer varieties of apples are there?
At the end of the 19th century, at the end of the 1800s, there were 14,000 varieties of apples. People were grafting and creating new apples all the time. The only apple native to North America is the crab apple.
Oh.
By the end of the 19th century, there were 14,000 varieties. Now there's only about 2,500 varieties.
Question. Which quantity is greater? The amount of apple varieties currently available, or the amount of names available to Icelandic parents to use for their sons?
The U.S. has more varieties of apples today.
Wow.
At 2,500. I believe that number was much lower. Was it not?
I don't know, but dear listener, if you want to know, go back and listen to the episode entitled Drag Daughters in Rouge, wherein we talk about the French language, the fact that rouge is makeup, the Icelandic naming conventions, and drag queens.
That is episode 7 for those keeping track at home.
Absolutely. Well, Brother Brad, I think it's time to tie this all together. So if we're talking about Johnny Appleseed spreading the word of Sweden's Leonardo da Vinci in the form of Emanuel Swedenborg, we might as well tie things up by talking to Elmore, Ohio's Leonardo da Vinci. He's our father art, and we're going to ask him some questions.
Who would win in a wrestling match between Johnny Appleseed, Johnny Bench, Johnny Cash, and Western outlaw Johnny Ringo? For the purpose of this question, assume that each is alive and at his physical prime.
Well, my money would be on Johnny Appleseed because he could cover great distances, but I think that bag of seed probably would get in his way.
If somebody offered to give you a bunch of seeds and said that if you take care of the trees, they will split the fruit with you, would you take that deal?
Not right now because I'm not allowed to grow anything at my condo, but if I was a property owner again or a landowner again, I would take cherry seeds in a minute.
Do you know anything about Swedenborgianism, aka the New Church?
Just in passing, not enough to be dangerous.
Who would win in a tennis match between Björn Borg and 18th century mystical Emanuel Swedenborg? Please assume that they are both alive and at their prime during the match.
Well, I never saw the other guy play, so I would go with Bjorn Borg, or maybe the Swedish chef because he would have been able to talk to Bjorn Borg while they played.
Well, folks, now that we've heard from Father Art, it means that our time together is coming to an end for this episode. We've said just about everything we're prepared to say about Dr. Oz, Fort Wayne TinCaps baseball, mysticism, Bunyan and Fabien Joe Fournier, bananas, Pastafarianism, and Applejack brandy. But fear not, just as soon as we can dig back into the archives and find another gem of a text exchange, there will be another episode coming your way. In the meantime, you can head over to our Instagram page at Things I Text My Brother Podcast to drop us a note about what you liked, what you didn't like, or to tell us something that we got totally wrong. You might even have enough time to go tell a friend, an enemy, and a total stranger to give us a listen as well. If you manage to do any of that, the fraternity of Drouillards would be forever grateful. But most importantly, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
For God's sakes, John, sit down.
Sit down, John. Sit down, John.
For God's sakes, John, sit down.
We're only 11 minutes in. This is glorious. If we end it now, it'll be our shortest episode.
It will be our shortest episode.
Yeah.
Facts.
I can't believe that you actually feel like we owe our listeners something. Our listeners aren't buying any of our merch.
Do we have merch?
Nope.